Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Jim Stockard. I'm the curator of the Loeb Fellowship here at the Graduate School of Design. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight the third senior Loeb Scholar to join the GSD in the past 3 years. This is a program initiated by our dean, Mohsen Mostafavi, and supported by the Loeb Fellowship. And the idea is to bring thinkers to our school whose work involves and the dialogue that they will have with us over the next 2 weeks is something which is normally somewhat outside the discourse which dominates our hallways most days. Richard Sennett is certainly one of those people. I am particularly pleased, some of you in the audience will know that I have a bit of an interest in public housing. And so I'm especially pleased to introduce a graduate of Cabrini Green, one of America's most infamous public housing sites. To give you a bit of history for Mr. Sennett, he graduated from there to come to another difficult environment here at Harvard, where he studied with Erik Erikson, with Oscar Handlin, with David Reisman, and took a PhD in the history of American civilization. He's getting close now to what we're interested in, and then he became a fellow at the Joint Center for what was then called the Joint Center for Urban Studies of Harvard and MIT, where at least his biography says he first became an urbanist. I would argue maybe it was a little sooner than that. Richard Sennett's scholarly work centers on the topics which we've all read some, frankly, rather dry books about: the development of cities, the nature of work, and the sociology of culture. However, his work really focuses in each of those areas on human beings engaged in those settings. He talks about not just cities and the development of cities, but how the development of cities and the physical shape of those cities has impacted the individuals who live in those cities, and how they understand themselves in those cities, and how they understand their relationship to those cities. His work on the nature of work is not so much about the mechanics as about the people and how they have reacted to that changing work. We may know his work earliest from his first book, The Uses of Disorder, written a considerable number of years ago, which I will not reveal at this particular moment. But he spent the 70s writing about cities and several other books. I'm going to get to him and not have me talk so much. In the 80s, he became what all scholars essentially want to do. He became a novelist and wrote 3 interesting novels, which I'm sure he might like to tell you about at some later moment. In the mid-90s, he began work in a topic that I think is of significant interest to all of us. He began to think about how the world was changing because work was changing so dramatically. As we got to a point where technology became a dominant factor in our society, where the assembly line was disappearing for many people, what was the impact of that dramatic change on so many of our urban dwellers, the middle-level management, the middle-level workers, the working-class folks? How would that change affect their own impact, their own feelings about themselves, their feelings about the cities they lived in, and their hope for what their future might look like? That work has led right up until today, and there are 3 books in that topic, which he may also talk about tonight. But most recently, I understand, and this is only an understanding, I can't profess to be an expert, he's begun to look at the question of cooperation. How is it in our cities where we have been building picket fences for so long and finding other ways to separate ourselves, how is it that we create cities which might encourage us to do what cities are all about, that is, to come together, to do things together, to understand how our cities can function better if we connect with each other, and how that elusive quality of cooperation might be something that dominates our cities more in the future than it has in the past few decades. With that, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce to you Richard Sennett, the third Loeb Senior Scholar.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm also glad to see you're wearing a tie which has where we live in London right in the center of the tie, which is great. I'm delighted to come to Harvard. I taught here many, many years ago in the late 80s, and I haven't had a chance to spend time since then. And I will be around this week and next week You'll find me occasionally showing up at a tray saying, "What are you doing?" And I hope that's all right with you, because I'm really curious about what's happened to the school and what people this generation are doing in it. What I thought I'd do tonight is talk a little about my present concerns, and in the hopes not of giving you some kind of grand lecture, but in terms of sort of starting a discussion with you, which we can have both in the seminars we'll have, the conference we'll have this weekend, and as I say, when I suddenly pop up next to you at your tray, I'd be interested to get comments from you as well. I've just published a book on cooperation, and it's part of a trilogy of books called the Homo Faber Project, which is about man as maker. That's what Homo Faber means. And I am interested in the relation between social and material practices. And the first of these books in this trilogy was a book called The Craftsman, which is about the making of things and the experience of making them well. This book is about the making of social relations, and again, the making of them well. And the third volume is going to be a volume on the city. I'm returning to my first love, as it were, and how cities could be made well. So the talk I'm going to give you tonight is kind of transition between the work I've done in the past and the work that I'm going to do in the future. And I would, as I say, the more you can tell me about your own reactions, the happier I'll be. I'm going to talk tonight about three things. This talk is called The Architecture of Cooperation. I'm going to talk first about the social architecture of cooperation. Second, I'm going to talk about one aspect of the physical architecture of cooperation. And finally, I'm going to talk about the relation between the cooperation and the city. And I'm very long-winded, by the way, so settle in. I do not give short lectures. Let me start by giving you some orientation about what this term means. In general, cooperation in its generic form means working with others to do what you can't do for yourself. The particular aspect of cooperation that interests me is the difficult sort of cooperation, which is working with those whom you don't understand, who are strangers, or whom you dislike. And that could be understood as a subcategory of cooperation that deals with cooperation and difference. And in my book, which is wonderfully inexpensive, and there's stacks of it in Harvard Coop, I focus on what it is, not the easy sorts of cooperation with people who are similar to yourself, but this difficult sort of cooperation which involves the encounter with difference. Why should we worry about this? I just want to say a word about this. It's not news to you in the political realm that Americans are having trouble cooperating with people who are different. I think that's a polite way of saying it. Cooperation is broken down in the political sphere. But it's equally true that cooperation is breaking down in civil society. There are some small signs of that which are kind of interesting, which can focus your mind on what that breakdown means. And I'll just cite two of them to you. One concerns children and one concerns neighbors. A recent study by UNICEF tried to look in 22 developed countries at the experiences of cooperation and isolation of children. And their conclusion is pretty depressing for Americans. They see that when American children get into schools, that they rapidly become fairly uncooperative creatures. For instance, we're at the bottom on this UNICEF scale of those 22 countries in terms of the degree to which children study with each other. We're at the bottom also on the interactions between children and adults. Americans, this is the statistics, this is how we do statistics. They're all great generalizations. Typically, American families have at meal times about 17 minutes of interaction between children and adults, whereas in Germany, at meal times there's an hour and 20 minutes of interaction. That's another kind of way of looking at the degree to which across generations there's a kind of interaction. Another kind of statistic concerns adults themselves. A study done by SOPEC has done a panel study in the past and present about how much people believe their neighbors would respond if you needed immediate help. And again, Americans score, it's an international study, Americans score very little on that, the most low on that. The important thing is that in the last 30 years, the numbers of people who believe that their neighbors would come to their help has dropped by about 30%. We were low 30 years ago, but in those 30 years, fewer and fewer people believed that their neighbors would help out if there were a fire, a domestic crisis, and so on. And that's a doubled phenomenon, because if you believe your neighbors are unlikely to help you, you aren't going to behave to them in a way which invites help. So, you know, these are sort of small signs, not they're everyday signs, of a problem of cooperation. Not necessarily a problem of cooperating with people who are different, but the sheer problem in this country of cooperating with one another. And my argument in the book is that that problem magnifies and multiplies when the people that you might turn to for help are of a different race, ethnic background, class, sexual orientation than yourself. So I think this is a real issue, practical issue for us as Americans about why we were becoming an uncooperative society. I'd like to say a couple of things about the phenomenon of cooperation in relation to autonomy and competition, just to set the stage for this. Poland Spring, delicious. We know from work that psychologists have done that there are developmental crises that appear early in human beings' life about dealing with cooperation. The first of them has to do with the relation between cooperation and autonomy. It's an issue which surfaces when children are typically between 4 and 6. The notion that that you reach out to other people for help goes into a kind of crisis when a child begins to develop an imago or a sense of distinctive self, so that cooperation, far from seeming just a win-win exchange, becomes a zero-sum game of win and lose. And what you're losing is something innate to yourself when you reach out or are reached out to by other people. It's another way to formulate this is that children in this modal stage have to deal with the relationship between dependence on others and autonomy. And that's something that continues throughout people's lives. It's not an issue that ever gets resolved, but it's a kind of dynamic, an unsettling dynamic. The other has to do with cooperation and competition. We often think about cooperation and competition as though they're opposites. But a moment's reflection, especially for anybody who's played a sport, will show us that this is not the case. You cooperate with your team members in order to compete, but even more crucially, you have to cooperate with those you're going to compete against, as for children, in the setting of rules of competition, so that who doesn't cheat, the rules about cheating and so on. If cooperation were simply a matter of giving away something to others, if it didn't have this ludic structure in relation to competition, then you'd have a Hobbesian world of, instead of playing a game, you'd simply, batter the other side into submission. And that's something children begin to deal with, how to balance cooperation. It seems between the ages of 5 and 8, it's something they begin to work out, and it stays with us through our entire lives. So just as a preface to this, that if it's true that, as most biologists now think, that cooperation is something genetically implanted in all human beings as social animals, it's also true that in the articulation of the development of a human life, that there's a constant need to manage the tensions between cooperation and autonomy on the one hand, and cooperation and competition on the other. And that's where the question of skill comes in, ratcheted up at the point at which the people that you're experiencing these tensions of autonomy and competition with are people unlike yourself. I want to, as I say, after this very long prologue, describe to you 3 adult skills which are needed for difficult or demanding sorts of competition. These are social skills, and the reason I'm laying this out to you in this form is that then I want to get in the second part of the talk to what these have to do with this, the physical architecture of cooperation. We can understand these 3 skills needed for difficult or demanding cooperation in terms of a set of polarities. One is between dialectic and dialogic interchange. The second is between declarative versus subjunctive expression. And the third is between identifying the other in terms of sympathy or in terms of empathy. And I'm going to explain these to you unashamedly. This is social science rather than architecture, but I'm going to try and make this clear to you. The distinction between dialectic and dialogic is a fundamental property of understanding what exchanges between human beings are like. The dialectic is something in which there's a give and take in exchange that arrives in a conclusion or a form of closure. The dialogic is a form of exchange which doesn't seek for closure, doesn't even seek really for common ground, but a different kind of interrelationship. You probably all learned in school that dialectic involves thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. I say X, you say not X, and then we come together in this glorious cooperative moment and fuse the thesis and antithesis in some common thing. This is a school book a version of dialectics which is infantile. We do better to think about this in the terms that Hegel thought about dialectics. For Hegel, dialectics are all embedded in power relations, particularly between masters and slaves. This is something that appears in the phenomenology, that central chapter on the master and the slave in Hegel. The idea is, because it's a power relation, I say that my thesis to you as a worker is, you're really lazy. That's a thesis. The antithesis of that is something other than saying, no, I'm not lazy. It's saying, you know, the work we got in last week is really interesting to me. In other words, what's involved in a dialectic, a Hegelian dialectic, is dislocation of discourse. That's how you get an interplay in this power relationship between thesis and antithesis. That the servant, the slave, responds in a way which dislocates the dominant speech of the master. And the result of that process, the synthesis, is that gradually both sides begin to try and communicate across these barriers of dislocation. This is also the Habermasian idea of communicative interaction. So rather than yes, no, yes and no becoming something new, it's a much more adult process of dealing with the fact of resistance and overcoming resistance. The point about dialectic in these terms is that it has closure, and many forms of practical cooperation need to have that kind of closure. That is, in technical terms, it's a bounded narrative with a denouement. Dialogics is not that kind of experience of exchange. The term comes from Mikhail Bakhtin. Any of you read him? Yeah, good. Architecture students read what sociologists don't. That's good. And it's a term, this is very percoloso. It's a term that has translated from literary study into what we would call, for instance, listening skills. A dialogic listening skill is when somebody says to you something, you look at the intent of what they're saying beneath the words. That is, you don't take language at face value as carrying a bounded set of meanings, but you try and look at intentions about what people mean to say but don't have the words for, or the things that they're afraid to surface. So it is a skill of exchange which, as I say, focuses on responsiveness to the covert rather than the overt. And for Bakhtin, and this has been, the work of Bakhtin is important for social scientists in this regard. The notion about this is that this is an unclosed system. That is, there will be no resolution to that. There'll be no moment where the implicit, the hidden, can be surfaced and resolved with the other. But it remains in a condition which is unresolved as a process. Now, so one way to think about this is closure versus process. I'd argue that dialogic, it's not that I would argue, I do argue that dialogic skills of that listening sort are important for us in dealing with difficult forms of communication. That is, we have to eschew closure in that sort. And I'd like to make a comment to you about this, that kind of social skill has a relationship to material craft work in that it focuses on problem finding. And if you read my craftsman book, another wonderfully inexpensive text, this is, it's an issue that I take up in material craft work in the relationship between problem solving and problem finding. Dialogics puts the emphasis, as in craft work, on problem finding rather than on resolution. Okay, so that's one social skill. A second one has to do with the relationship between declarative and subjunctive in expression. Declarative expression is, it's very simple to us. I believe X. Subjunctive expression is something that withdraws from that kind of grammatical formulation. The Brits, as Moisen and I know, are masters of this. For instance, in your wonderfully lucid presentation, I was interested to note that, and then the punch of, comes up. I'm going to try and explain to you why the subjunctive form of expression is more friendly to difficult forms of cooperation than declarative. The model we have for declarative expression is really that of debating as a process. Again, you say X, I counter this, and so on. The idea in declarative expression is, of course, to be as clear and as persuasive as possible. And the result of that can be that declarative expression not only mobilizes Aufklärung, that is, how can I say it, enlightenment in the sense of suddenly making something clear, but it also is a way of channeling aggression, right? That's what debating is all about, whether it's political or debate teams or whatever. When you speak like a Brit, I would have thought then that, or perhaps, what you're doing is opening up a space of ambiguity where there can be interaction between people. You're privileging ambiguity over clarity for the sake of a kind of interaction. If Moisen says to me, well, I would have thought that perhaps blah, 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 so on, then I have a kind of space of ambiguity. I don't quite know where he is, So we have to get more and more involved in exchange with each other to sort of get to that point. These are not quite innocent categories in terms of power either. I take about the declarative mode a very wise observation made by the philosopher Bernard Williams, that it embodies a fetish of assertion. That is, that it makes assertion into a kind of fetish. He thinks of it as quite male, which we could discuss. But the notion is that the important thing in communicating with somebody else is to express will. That's the fetish element in it. And therefore, it's a mode of domination for him. Declaration is a mode of domination, whereas the subjunctive is an attempt to withdraw from the notion of dominating the other by one's own clarity and leaving a space free. Again, there's a craft element in this between the physical and the social, and that is that the subjunctive is an application of minimum force. It's just like, when we're working with, well, I do want to get into this at great length, but you'd never go home. is an important point about getting skilled in physical craftsmanship, is the application of minimum force. Not trying to hammer something to bend to one's will, which often deforms it. And the same thing is true in social relations, that when we use minimum force, we open up a space for more interaction. So in that sense, I do argue, to be declarative about it, that this kind of subjunctive expression is more usable as a tool for complex communication than declaration. The third issue that's involved in these social skills has to do with the distinction between sympathy and empathy. They both address the question of how do we recognize the other. Now, the classic formulation of sympathy that most of, or many of you may know, is that of Adam Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is he sees, as he puts it, a poor wretch falling down in the street, and he thinks, my goodness, he can feel it physically in his own body, this person on the street, and he reaches out to help him. The Smithian idea of sympathy is therefore an issue about identification. There but for the grace of God go I, and so on. And that is, you put yourself in the place of the other, and because you identify, you want to help. You want to help them do what they can't do for themselves. Empathy is quite a different address to the other. It deploys curiosity, or what Elaine Scarry calls wonder, in the address to the other. That is, you're sort of interested in what's going on with that person. It would be inappropriate if somebody's just been run over by a truck, right? It deals with a different kind of situation where somebody is in a kind of pain that you don't understand, and you stay with them rather than withdraw. Say moral pain, something we can discuss on the weekend, personal pain that you don't understand. And you're curious about what's going on with them, or you have a kind of sense of wonder in another way about what's going on. And so you become engaged. This is just inter alia. Is Elaine Scarry somebody who comes to the GST? This is what she means by, this is what she did to the old Schiller notion of the Unheimlich. That it's really about curiosity, not about magic. It's just that other that you become curious about. The contrast between, in that sense, between sympathy and identification and empathy and curiosity is between something hot emotionally and something relatively cool. It's, if you like, also between a kind of subjective identification and something that's more scientific. And my colleague Sarah Hurdy has looked at empathy in just those terms, that the progress of scientific investigation proceeds by the capacity to mobilize the wonder, this kind of cool interest in something that's other than yourself. What I'd like to say to you about this is that there's also a power relationship here. That is, when we express sympathy, God, I feel what you're feeling. It's as though we're saying, nothing is really foreign to me. You know? Any experience you have, if I react to you, I'm going to identify as though I understand it myself. That's a form of a kind of almost magisterial self. There's nothing that someone else can experience, which you can't make sense of and identify with yourself. So it is a mode of sort of taking control, right? That there's nothing that you can't react to and understand through identification. For Hannah Arendt, this is why sympathy is a terrible address to the other, because sympathy is always close to a notion of condescension and pity, right? There's nothing that happens to you that I can't understand. Poor you, you know. The emphasis is on me understanding you. There's nothing foreign about you. And it's why Arendt privileged empathy, this colder domain of curiosity about the other. And I would observe to you again about this that it has a correlation to craft work, and it's a very simple one, that sympathy is all about the deployment of subjectivity, and empathy is about the deployment of object-centered objectivity in the sense of the address to the other. So, on the social side, what I would say to you is that demanding cooperation is better served by dialogic, subjunctive, empathic social exchange than it is by dialectical, declarative, sympathetic exchange. Okay? That's where this is my argument. What does this mean about the title, the sort of the basic title of this talk, which is the architecture of cooperation? What does it mean spatially? I'm going to focus on this, on just one phenomenon, which I want to elaborate when we have politics of what I'm going to talk about edges, and I'll talk about with you at the conference this weekend about the politics of edges. Here, I want to just talk to you about how the edge condition is related to this experience of dialogic, subjunctive, empathetic social exchange. And maybe I can just initiate this by telling you about a terrible mistake in my own planning practice. I worked in the early 80s on the development of something called La Marqueta in New York City, which is a Spanish market meant to serve in Spanish Harlem the burgeoning population of Spanish community and get Spanish food for sale, etc. And we had a choice about where to locate it. We could have located it in the center of Spanish Harlem on 115th Street, or at the edge of Spanish Harlem, then as it was then on East 96th Street, just on the edge between this very poor community and one of the richest places in the world, which is the Upper East Side. And we made a terrible error. We decided to locate this community service in the center of the community rather than the edge. The reasons we did that were, some were practical. The market still goes on, although it's been taken over by a Cuban multinational. I don't know, this the adventures of capitalism, which Saskia will have to explain to you. I can't do that. But the problems with it from the very beginning were that it was a lost opportunity in the city. That is, if we had located it on 96th Street, at midnight, if a lady in a chinchilla coat needed a quart of milk, she would have gone to La Marqueta and been physically in the presence of people who were very poor. They would have been mixed together. from an urban perspective, the edge, locating this market at the edge, would have had more social value in terms of the larger city than locating it in the center of the community. And wiser planners have learned from this mistake. It also meant that there wasn't as much money going into the market and so on. But the main issue to me was that the mixture of these two very different people didn't happen in the body, corporeally, by a presence. And I've thought a lot about edge conditions as a result of this bad mistake from which others have, in planning practice, have since learned in New York. And what I'm going to say to you tonight is about that. I'm talking about corporeal and bodily interaction, not verbal interaction for the moment. Edges come in two forms. They come as borders or as boundaries. We know this distinction at the most elemental biological level between cell walls and cell membranes. A cell wall is a relatively rigid structure now this one tip. Sorry, let's put this down again. Oh no, it fits right here. I should have known the GSD provided for everything. A cell wall is a relatively rigid structure which is essentially trying to be simply a container. A cell membrane is more a structure. It's an edge which is more flexible and more open. Biologically, many edges in cells can switch from the wall condition, which is entirely focused on retention, to the membrane condition. But the membrane condition is really interesting for reasons that ultimately become social as well. Cell membranes are both porous and resistant. That is, they're simply not open structures. They're not open doors. They combine porosity and resistance and work out the balance between these two in a dynamic condition. And basically, just to foreground where I'm going in this, my argument is that in edges, both urban and social, that combination of porosity and resistance is a spatial precondition for the kinds of social interactions that involve cooperating between people who differ. So that's where I'm trying to go in the argument now. If we go from, may I say just one side thing about that? Oftentimes when I teach urban design to students, their notion is that when there's a rigid separation between two communities, two classes, two functions, and so on, the best thing you can do is take out your eraser and get rid of all the divisions between them. That is, that sheer openness is a sign of interaction. And this is an error. And it's an error founded in a basic biological principle that we need to mark space, and that space has to have some quality of protection as well as opening to the outside. That is a membrane condition. If you simply do a Google version of openness, that is, you take down all kinds of every wall you see, you don't promote social interaction. Simply removing barriers as a rough thing is not a way to promote social interaction. And it has a physical basis in this biological quality of membrane condition being both resistant and porous. Let's now make a jump from the cell to ecologies. It tells us something interesting about the difference between borders and boundaries. Here, a boundary is meant to mark a territory where interaction ends. Like, you know, tigers, you'll see in my book there's a diagram of tiger droppings, about how tigers measure out boundaries in this way. The idea is if you cross this, you're in trouble. A boundary, in other words, is in natural ecologies meant to be a place where interaction diminishes. A border in natural ecologies is a place where interaction between different species increases and where biological activity is greater. For instance, in the layers in the ocean, different temperature layers, the borders between those layers are sites of intense feeding activity and also of other forms of biological exchange. Or again, where the land meets the water at a shoreline is a border in the sense that the activities normally contained within intensify at this border condition. Again, both feeding, competition, but also forms of nutrients exchange and so on. And border conditions as between where the land and the water meet are the scenes of the greatest the speed of evolutionary change because of the intensity of what's going on there. This is important to us because we need to think about boundaries as forms of death, right? Relative death, what Orlando Patterson calls in another context social death, where nothing much is happening that's of a displacing sort. And borders are places of a more intense form of life. They again bear on the issue of cooperation because this border condition is something where differences need to be negotiated, where there has to be exchange, and where that exchange can become intense as well as complex, whereas the whole point about a boundary is to inhibit exchange. Let's take another jump again to much more familiar territory, to the urban. We know boundaries in the form, for instance, of traffic walls, which separate rich communities from poor communities. The flow of traffic is like a wall. It's a border. There's meant to be no interaction between the rich and poor neighborhoods. It segregates. If any of you know Latin American cities like Bogota, I suppose Mexico City has a lot of this too. We've designed these boundary lands principally through using traffic to keep people apart, to make the actual edge dead. And you would contrast that, a borderland would be, again, think of an office campus or a cultural complex where everything happens inside. Those are forms of boundaries rather than borders. An office complex removes people, an office campus removes people from interaction with the outside. When I've talked to people who work in the Googleplex, it's really interesting. For about a year and a half, the notion that when you're at work, everything is taken care of for you. You know, your laundry is done. People do your shopping. Somebody goes, cleans your house. All of that is wonderfully exciting. After about a year or two at the Googleplex, the sheer fact of that kind of isolation seems deadening. And of course, it's also dominating because you're inside the Googleplex. You're working 24/7, you know. But when we've done interviews, when my team and I have done interviews of people who have spent more than a couple of years in this kind of condition, the boundary seems to them to be absolutely deadening, and it's one of the main reasons people leave Google, because of this isolation. The contrast to that, the border condition would be much more like a mixed-use street, right? Which lots of things are happening in the same place at the same time. There's lots of difference. There's lots of that bodily interaction and bodily presence. Now, what I'd argue to you about this is that in modern urbanism, the boundary dominates the border. Boundary, we know how to make great boundary conditions, and we're very relatively uninterested or unskilled in making border conditions that suit modern society. And as a result, the spaces in which people could develop the three skills that I've described here earlier in this talk are not spaces of learning how to cooperate. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? That if what you do is create a city of edges in which the boundaries dominate, boundaries are definitive, they're declarative, they create closure. The sympathy doesn't quite fit into this. But when you create boundary conditions in this city, you de-skill people from learning how to practice empathic, subjunctive dialogic exchange. And that's where I see the social architecture of cooperation and this physical condition of the edge interacting. That's the proposition I want to put to you. And I actually want to push it, and this is where I'll conclude this talk, by saying that something that should be shocking to you, but maybe isn't, but I want to make it shocking to you. That basically what we see in a lot of the suppositions of modern urban planning is an effort of de-skilling people. That is to say, this isn't an innocent process. It just happens, we just happen to locate this 8-lane highway between a rich and a poor area in Caracas, and, it just happened, I believe it's more malign than that. I think that what we're actually doing in modern planning is de-skilling people from preventing people from developing the kinds of skills that would allow them to live in difference. And let me tell you why that phrase is so, for me, powerful. The notion of de-skilling comes, it's an issue in labor studies. It plays out from radical Marxists like Harry Braverman to not so radical liberals like Bob Reich. And the notion of it is as follows. We always think about modern society, the cliche we always use about it is it's a skills society, right? That's what everybody tells us. That's what Tom Friedman tells us. That's what our adored president tells us, that skills are constantly developing in modern society, that skills are the kind of material foundation both of our economy and so on, education system and so on. The critics of that view, as I say, going from Braverman to Reich, argue that this is not the case, that the development of skills in certain realms of society involves the de-skilling of people in other realms. In the labor realm that I know best, this has been evident to me in the effect that the globalization of manufacturing has had on the craft sector, which is it's de-skilled huge numbers of craft workers for the sake of cheaper labor abroad, and it's used. I'm not going to go through the whole argument about it. Mechanization has been used, and so on. But the notion is that skilling and de-skilling are inseparable processes. That's the idea of this. Every time we add a skill, we subtract a skill somewhere else. And I think the same thing applies to our understanding of the spatial realm. It's an issue that for me is deeply involved in thinking about smart cities, for instance, which deploy technological skills of a certain sort, that is, of getting people, using the shortest line between 2 points and getting them there as fast as you can with no intervening resistance. Or in the case of Masdar, for instance, having somebody else do all the driving for you. Masdar is this tech city that is in the Gulf that Norman Foster's been involved in which the cars drive themselves. You just get in. That's kind of technological skilling, but it's a kind of human de-skilling in the fact that the subject is removed, the interpreting subject, right? And particularly the interpreting subject exposed to difference, to strangeness, to things that require a measure of curiosity, or in Elaine Scarry's term, wonder, that is, engagement. I think the edge conditions that we note totally embody this problem of this between skilling and de-skilling. They are a way of creating order in the city, by definition, at the expense of giving people the life skills to negotiate ambiguous terrains which require interaction. And that, it seems to me, is the great political challenge that the edge raises to us, that it can do, defined edges can do terrible, terrible harm to people's social relations. Now, at some point during the next week, I'd like to talk to you about what this means about individual buildings. I haven't thought this through, but the geographical edges that I've described to you would also apply to the building envelope, and indeed internally, as we were talking about before, to the insides of buildings as well, about how you create this condition of resistance and porosity that can arouse people to interact with each other in a realistic way. I have a different kind of image of the city than, say, Foster's, about what it would look like if we had a city of borderlands, a city of membranes. It would be kind of a capillary city in which things flowed through channels, and like a capillary, like a cell wall, is something that's both resistant and porous, but it would be in which the capillaries are open, in which they can be reconfigured, in which the experience of moving through the system was one that was arousing in a way that would provoke people to want to interact with those who are unlike themselves. So this is what, in sum, I mean by the architecture of cooperation. The social architecture embodies three phenomena because it requires skill. It requires the skills of dialogic exchange. It requires modes of expression which are subjunctive rather than declarative. And it requires an address to the other and an understanding of the other, which is empathic rather than sympathetic. On the physical side, the architecture of cooperation, the foundation for it, is a certain kind of experience of the edge, an experience of the edge in which both porosity and resistance are enabled. My argument to you is that in the physical realm, that the problems we have in urbanism today are that the boundary dominates over the border, with the result of impeding the spaces in which this complex cooperation can be learned. And indeed, to make this a little darker, that people are being de-skilled by many of the physical clarities that mark the modern city. So that's it. Thank you very much. What do you want to do? Talk? Of course. Questions, dialogical comments, whatever. Can you hear me if I get away from this podium? Yeah. Oh, you need a mic. Okay. I don't need a mic.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I'm wondering if you think that the edge condition, if you could talk about the edge condition between us as humans and the rest of our environment, and if you think that creating a cooperative boundary between humans and the rest of the environment is something that could also help us in terms of sustainability in the way we live.
Yeah, this is something I want to write about in a new book. I haven't gotten far in this, but I'll tell you as far as I've gotten in this. And I've come at this from a really odd vantage point. A lot of my students do landscape urbanism in London. That's what they like to do. And if I touch a plant, as Saskia knows, it withers. I mean, we are not great gardeners, the two of us. But one of the discussions we've been having about this is the notion of whether these gardens or landscape structures that they're making should be sustainable in the sense that they're self-perpetuating. And it's been an interesting discussion for us because that's a bounded condition, you know, a kind of municipal park which doesn't require any gardening, or in the modern version, you know, any participant gardening, or in the modern version, a landscape which tends to be self-equilibrating over time. That's a bounded condition. It doesn't invite engagement. So over the last few years, what we've been looking at is how to design. It sounds like crazy too, but it makes a lot of sense. How do you design landscapes which are in disequilibrium, which need constant intervention by the people who are using it in order to survive? So this has been a long discussion for us. We haven't published any of this material yet. We hope to do it next year. But you understand what the issue is here. If we think about sustainability as something that's self-sustaining, a condition which has perfect feedback, or in the way our Piet Udolf, who has worked with us on this, you know, who did the High Line, his notion is that basically you get the plants in the ground and they fight it out, and the ones that survive over time, that's it, you know. Our notion is to intervene so that that kind of distance, you know, that nature doesn't do that work, but that people become the protector, for instance, of, you know, fragile parts of that landscape. The idea about that lies behind it is that when we think about sustainability as self-sustaining equilibrium, we have removed it from this notion of a dynamic edge. But most of our ideas about sustainability veer to that notion, something that can just go on as a system without human intervention from time to time. I haven't gotten much farther than that, you know, and I probably never will because, as I say, the vegetable world is one that is, I have a black thumb, but I think the issue is one, even for people who are able to think about this kind of landscape urbanism in practical terms, is a valuable one. And can I just say one more thing about this? It has to do, in general, with discourses about sustainability. The Masdar notion is that everything is in this perfect feedback loop. You know, it's in equilibrium. If a system is in equilibrium, rather than, this is not an original thought to me, what I'm about to say to you, it's a basic idea of Norbert Wiener, who is the first systems analyst. It's a closed system. And the system balances, nothing happens. It takes in nothing new. It doesn't learn except how to rebalance itself. And I think that's a very bad model of sustainability for us. I think we need a much more active model, a much more open system model, in which disequilibrium, disruption, play a role in thinking about sustainability. So anyhow, that's what I'm writing about in this new book. Sorry to be so long-winded. Let's see, you need a microphone. You have a microphone. Very clever.
When I hear you outline the content of your current book, and I think about the themes as well that resonate through the craftsman,
Yeah.
one ghost that I sometimes hear hovering at the back of the books, but I'm not sure whether it is a correct influence, is the ghost of Peter Kropotkin. And I sometimes wonder, to put things very crudely, and not to box you in at all, but is Richard Sennett's political project to re-envisage a Kropotkinian social democracy? Dialogical Kropotkinian social democracy.
The answer is yes. Since you asked me about that, I'd just tell you something about my own biography. When I wrote The Uses of Disorder, which is a book about anarchism in the city, I tell you a little about this because it's interesting, not so much about me, but about Jane Jacobs. When I wrote The Uses of Disorder, my first reviewer was Jane Jacobs. And I mean, I adored her. She was somebody I knew throughout her life. She wrote a rather negative review of this book. She said, because this it assumes that to have life in the city, you need to have disorder in it, which I believe. And she said, in my view, she had just written The Economy of Cities. Markets are a stabilizing force in all cities. And we get life from the vivacity of market exchange, which is stable. And it seemed to me that maybe that's true economically, although I don't think it is, but maybe it's true, but that it's not true of our social and psychological life. That, and it's something I early on took from my teacher, Erik Erikson, that we need to experience disruption in order to pay attention to things that have become ingrained habit. And it is anarchism of a sort. It's not and it has a logic, which is that if you have control from above, we'll talk about this on Saturday about the politics of the edge. The boundary condition is control from above. The border condition is something that is built from the bottom up. And my notion about this is that that building is continually incomplete. You know, people have to revise it. It's full of conflict and so on. That's the kinds of things that make social experience and and psychological experience count to us, that we've engaged with something difficult, something that we can't master, even something we can't identify with, but it's real. So, from the beginning, this book is subtitled Urban Anarchism, This Uses of Disorder. And I've tried to give it a kind of cast that deals with social processes and psychological processes, rather than, for Kropotkin, it was the destruction of the state. I'd like to see that occur maybe, except for Medicare and Medicaid at my age. But I think the real issue about it is not the state, but something that has to do with behavior. So I'm a behavioral anarchist. How's that? How about, go ahead. Could we get somebody up here? We've excluded people far from the microphone.
Yeah,
so you get the last lower talk.
Is this on?
Yeah.
I want to ask you about what you think about gated communities.
What do you think I think?
In two forms, though. In Boca Raton, Florida, there's gated communities, and they're all wealthy. But the people in the $800,000 homes don't talk to the people in the $1.2 million homes.
Yeah.
And that seems to work because there's lots of resources. But, for example, in Detroit, like in the Tower in the Park developments just to the east of the downtown, they abandoned a bunch of streets to create these super blocks and effectively created a gated community where the whiter, wealthier people live and exclude the poorer minority folks, which creates a lot of tension because there's a scarcity of resources there. And the exchange was reduced through the larger roads to support the super block as opposed to the fine grain network and that sort of thing. And
Right.
perhaps you could comment on the
Well,
difference wealth makes.
I'd make a comment to you, but I also want to raise another issue about that. The comment is, that the ghost in the machine for Americans is class. And I think we're a very class-bound society, even though we don't talk about it. And the fact that you don't want to live with somebody who only has an $800,000 house is, part of that fine grain. I don't think that I know about this in a different way in terms of work that Richard Burdett and I have done about social housing. And this is part of the plans for the post-Olympics, because we were involved in doing the master planning for the Olympics. And part of it is the Olympic Village. How is that to be done? And the plan there is a very simple thing. It's mixed housing. That is, people who are on housing support and people who are not. But the whole idea was to make this anonymous, that you would never know from somebody's door or place in the project whether they were on income support or not. So you have wildly unlike kinds of apartments next to each other, studio apartments next to palaces, and so on. And this is an idea we took directly from Dutch housing planners, for whom the notion of the way to do mixed housing is anonymity. And that if you take that seriously, it isn't just sectoral, but it's something that goes to the level of each floor. It's very difficult. It's a terrible architectural challenge to bring something like this off. Will it work in Britain? I don't know. It works in the Netherlands because people aren't as attuned to class differences as they are in the United States. As long as you can close your door, you're not so worried if the neighbor next door is on housing support. Probably wouldn't work in this country, and it might work in Britain because it's had this long tradition of housing estates distributed through all sorts of, as on your tie, through all sorts of different areas. So, it's, again, I think it's this, Americans, we're not so good about being honest with ourselves about the conditions we live under. We're hypersensitive to difference in the way where we always rank differences from better to worse. We're constantly making difference into inequality. You know? Ah, why? That's a whole. Don't get me started. It's such a. We can talk about this. This goes on for. This is a very long discussion. Let's have one from the back, from the neglected upstairs. Can we get one or two comments? And then I would like a scotch at this point, and a smoke. So how about you? Do you have a microphone? Can somebody get it to you? There it is. C'est vous.
Oh, hi.
Where are you?
Right here.
There you are.
Okay, I have kind of a broad question, and I'm sorry to fit,
I know I'm at
conclude
Harvard.
with a broad
People
question.
don't ask narrow questions. Okay.
So when you were talking about Masdar and the Google campus, you spoke about technology in terms of producing certain efficiencies with a self-driving car and certain amenities at the campus, but at the expense of disengagement from
Right.
spaces of difference and empathy and all those things. With so many disciplines in the room that are reliant or indebted to technology and use it on a daily basis, do you see ways of deploying technology that encourage engagement with these things? And more generally, do you see technology as having inherent tendencies towards disengagement from these things?
I'm really glad you asked me that question because I think, in a way, you can give technology with a big T a very bum rap. The machines don't ask to be used in this way. They're programmed to be used in this way, you know? And when we have these discourses about the dehumanization of technology, in my day here, I can remember when I was a student, Lewis Mumford, arguing that, you know, technology was going to be the absolute bane of the modern city and so on. This is bullshit, you know. The machines don't say, I'd like to separate people now, you know, if they're programmed to do that. Masdar, for instance, is an extreme, in one way, it reflects a kind of notion that there are a single small group of programmers who are going to be in control of a whole city. Machines didn't ask for that, you know. You could use, there's a lot of good stuff in Masdar, but you could use that in a way where the inhabitants in a community have much more control over it. But they decided to do this, so there is a war, I don't know if any of you have been to Masdar, there's a war room, what they call it. And in that war room, you know, just like Dr. Strangelove, you know, there are all these, you know, screens. There are 4 or 5 guys, and they are every day regulating the whole city. That's not you know, the technology is a tool of domination. Another example of the same sort of thing, although maybe something we talk about in a conference. There's been a lot of discussion about, you know, among sociologists about how the malign effects of Facebook, you know, that this is isolating people. Maybe all of you have read Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, so on. And yet that same technology was used throughout the North African Rim, along with Twitter, neither of them designed for this, for political mobilization. So I think, you know, this is a bum rap, and it's a way of pushing off onto machines responsibilities that come to us. You wound me up on this, so I'm going to say just a few more things. I mean, I'm really interested in the fine details of how to do this. For instance, how do we get more flexible technologies in cities? I'm very interested in hydraulic bollards, and I'm doing a project now
on a hydraulic ballast as part of what's going to be in the Washington Mall, which is a project I'm working on. They're very complex technologically. They can be controlled by individual cars rather than somebody in a war room. We should use it, you know. We have, you know, the technology for building materials, which are fantastic, like carbon fiber posts and beams. Why would we eschew this light, strong, and eventually cheap technology? The point is, you know, the point is thinking about how to use it in a participatory way. And so, you know, what you're seeing in smart cities now is what capitalism understands as efficiency. And the technology is used to deliver efficiency, which is controlled by a few. Sorry, this is a long rant, but this is something I really feel it's important for us to get into this. How to rethink these technologies as humane. Because right now, they're in the hands of Cisco. All these people are making vast quantities of money out of essentially centralization and standardization. And that can't be socially smart.
Thanks.
One more question. Okay. You get it here. Oh, wait. I don't know wherever. Okay, whatever.
What struck me in your presentation about borders and boundaries was the absence of a particular word, which would be protection, that you didn't mention at all. And I have the feeling that perhaps it's a conscious decision that you didn't use the word of protection, but you could see it from any scale of borders, which perhaps in your definition would be more boundaries of countries, down to the scale of, for instance, human skin,
Right.
which also has a function of protections against.
Well, so does the membrane has that. It's got this resistance as well as porosity. You're absolutely right about that, because I think we're so obsessed about protection. You know, the obsession about being safe is a kind of admission that you can't cope. You know, it's fear. Now, and that's very strongly ingrained in me by, you know, the reaction of people to 9/11, for instance, in which keeping safe meant that it was a kind of a regime of power because people didn't think they could go on with, you know, that they were incapable of protecting themselves and so on. I think we're so obsessed by issues of protection that we give away many things in the name of keeping safe. And you know, sociologically, there are all sorts of terrible paradoxes about this. You know that the communities in large cities, over 500,000, the communities which have the lowest rates of crime are the communities in which crime figures highest as a worry about the city. Whereas in communities which have higher levels of crime, people are not, they're more sans gêne about it. They're accustomed to dealing with it and so on. If I speak to you personally about this, you mentioned Cabrini Green, and maybe it's a good way to, my childhood, to end on this. When I lived there, it wasn't the nightmare it became, but it was quite a dangerous place. And it was constant racial warfare. There was a minority of whites who lived there with a large majority of blacks who were, and it was the first time, this is in the 50s, when blacks could vent rage on whites. Kids did that. We learned how to deal with it. You know, all of us did, you know. And it wasn't great, you know. I didn't like living in this state of continual anxiety about, you know, being attacked. But I learned how to cope with it, and most, I would say, of the white and black kids did too. That's a very different thing from trying to create a kind of community in which nobody can get away with anything. Right? That means you have lockdowns, you know, the buildings become absolutely closed. You have lots of police, you know, you don't learn from the street. So to me, I feel human beings are capable of dealing with complex, maybe aversive situations. I mean, we do it all the time. But many of the social structures that we live in assume that we're not capable of taking care of ourselves. And that's where I think this issue about complex cooperation comes in. It's a tool for learning a kind of social competence, which means that we don't have to be protected by someone else. So thank you very much for coming. I look forward to seeing you in the next 2 weeks. Okay.